And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hey, Josh. Hey, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great day. And it's Wednesday and it's the Dark Ozarks.
Yes, it is. I'm excited. Excited to be back on for this episode and excited about this topic.
Me too. It's it's sort of a kind of something that is in the forefront of people's minds when they think of dark aspects of the Ozarks, but there's a lot more to it. And we're talking about Eureka Springs.
Oh, Eureka Springs, Arkansas. So for folks who might not be familiar or might be peripherally familiar, Eureka Springs is a small town, population of about 2,000. It is within its genre renowned as a tourist destination and has been in varying forms since its founding, actually even since before its founding on July 4th, 1889.
So really going back to the 1850s or 60s.
Yeah, it has an incredible history. It is also a very much its own. I would say I would hazard to say it is the only town in the Ozarks that has developed utterly its own culture.
Probably that's fair. There may be another, but it's probably the best example of that happening by far.
and in this regard, I guess I should qualify that with some explanation. Eureka Springs is not a generic. It is a tourist destination. It's not a generic tourist destination.
No,
you're not going to find a lot of the things that one thinks of when they think of tourism. The entire town is on the National Historic Registry. It is. It really. Some of the reasoning behind this, I think, is really fascinating, and comes out of post-Civil War Reconstruction. The majority of the historic buildings in Eureka Springs, which are incredibly beautiful, all date to the Victorian into the Edwardian era. And it is this all-encompassing 360-degree immersive experience of walking through a Victorian town that at the time of its building had an enormous amount of wealth, and yet the surrounding culture, the surrounding Ozarks culture, did not.
No, very, very much night and day as far as that goes. And again, when you go into town, it really is almost a suspension of disbelief, because it's just like, oh, you're expecting the man behind the curtains, or the facade or something, and it's not, because it makes you think it's something engineered by Disney or something.
It can really feel like, and of course it is a very beautiful town. And then over the course of successive generations and successive decades, the town has made and remade itself in a variety of ways, and all of those layers of what I would classify as cultural development, not like suburban development. Cultural development. The region is way too rocky to like drop custom suburbs in there, which is great. But
pink houses.
No. But in terms of the development of its culture, that it has aged and melded and morphed to meet certain forces, and it's beautiful but very unique. When you're outside, when you're in the regular Ozarks, is very different than when you're inside the Eureka Springs Ozarks.
Very true. And but again, there's still layers below the Victorian era that influence things even now, and a lot of the history.
It does, of course, in so many ways. The story begins with water.
Yeah.
It begins with the reports of healing springs, and
Yeah.
that's what has created the epicenter. It is valid to note, pardon me, it is valid to note that Eureka Springs was, in that respect, not unique in the Ozarks. There were many, many towns across the Arkansas and Missouri Ozarks that attempted, or for a period of time sustained, the same thing, which was capitalizing upon natural spring water for two things. One, to have travelers come and take the waters or take the cure, depending on who you're talking to, where they would essentially have a resort spa experience of some sort. And the more ill they were, the more desperate they were to spend their money, as a general rule.
True.
And then the second part was bottling said water and selling it regionally or nationwide. And the Ozarka bottling company actually got its start in Eureka Springs.
Yeah, and it's still going strong.
The two counterpoints to this that I see, just in terms of this aspect of the story, are Ponce and Otovie, which are two towns, one no longer in existence,
Yeah.
and Ponce, which is slowly diminishing in its population. I don't know what its population is at this point, but it's very, very small right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of feast or famine with these water towns, resort towns.
It can be, and the two, for differing reasons, Eureka Springs and Hot Springs, both in Arkansas, not only survived rather extravagantly, but they managed to thrive through multiple eras.
Speculation as to why. There's one big factor that they have in common that some of the others didn't.
The
silent investors.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Very, very, in the case of Eureka Springs, incredibly rich Union investors following the war. And it is of particular interest, and perhaps very informing of politics and culture from 150, 170 years ago, which of course is a constantly, something that's constantly in flux as well. But Eureka appears to be found, largely, it wasn't founded, but by 1890, certainly, well, even earlier in the 1880s, we were looking at Reconstruction. Arkansas had been recently readmitted into the Union under the steady guidance of a Union general as its new governor.
Yes.
And whose industriousness, both in terms of familial industriousness, Powell Clayton, his brothers, heavily influenced Arkansas business, infrastructure, and politics for decades following the war, and also helped ensure ineffective but pretty harsh feelings by a number of pro-Confederate blocs. Yeah,
that it wasn't exactly a smooth melding of things.
No, it wasn't. And I think it is that now for me, looking at the turbulent past even if you just deal with American history and American politics, if you're not even looking outside the US or into the past in Europe, etc. If you're just looking at American politics, it's actually very helpful in providing a well-rounded perspective to realize just how incredibly violent and how incredibly turbulent and contentious factions of the United States and factions of American politics have always been. And
well, and that's true. I mean, actually, I was having a conversation last night with someone that that came up, and it's like, what's going on? You know, we talk about how contentious things are today, but in reality, it's nothing as contentious as things were in the early 1800s or during the war period of Reconstruction.
And I think Reconstruction would have been a particularly difficult time for the obvious economic reasons. And just looking at Arkansas.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in contrast, Missouri, of course, was brutalized in terms of guerrilla warfare and just an enormous amount of violence. Of course, the southern half of Missouri, from an economic and industrialized position, was largely overlooked following the war, which led to a lot of generational poverty and a lot of really comparatively really dark times for the region, while much of the rest of the United States grew rather rapidly, industrialized rather rapidly. But an interesting point of comparison, this does relate to Eureka Springs, is that Missouri, in a way, avoided the stigmatization of being a southern state, although in many degrees it was.
Well, that is true, but now one thing that also kind of hurt rebuilding Missouri after the war is the Reconstruction Constitution that was passed, and one of the provisions of the state constitution was anyone that had served for the Confederacy in any way basically could not conduct business, could not perform their profession. And that lasted into the early 1870s. So, you had, in different places, you had different factors that really affected things, and that certainly didn't help anybody in the end. So,
no. And so, really briefly, since we're talking about the Civil War, we should talk about Saturday and Sunday in Carthage.
That's true. Very good point. Yes. Saturday and Sunday is the 161st anniversary reenactment of the Battle of Carthage, which is the first large-scale land battle of the Civil War, a couple weeks before Bull Run, first Bull Run. And it's also the largest reenactment in Missouri. It's going to be at the Civil War Ranch in Carthage, Missouri. You can Google that and find it. All kinds of activities, both days, starting in the morning, going to the evening, everything from the reenactment on both afternoons to drills, demonstrations of period skills, a ladies' tea, a cakewalk, a ball on Saturday night, all kinds of things.
It's going to be great.
And there's no admission. I think there's a $5 parking fee.
Wow, so. That's incredible. So we hope to see you all there. Dark Ozarks will be there.
We'll be there.
And State of the Ozarks will be there. So it's going to be pretty epic. And I love, to me, and this is a perhaps contentious position, but it's something that I really love, and I'm largely taking my cues from the administration policies that Lincoln set following the war, which was essentially saying yes, we've had this horrible conflict. How do we come back together as a nation?
Mhm.
And how do we move forward and allow both sides honor as Americans?
Well, and that reconstruction would have gone a lot more smoothly if the Johnson administration had continued that policy.
Yes. And to me anyway, the importance of not only remembering our history, which really is not particularly distant
No.
in the scheme of things, and celebrating celebrating valor, not through the proverbial rose-colored glasses. We're not deifying these individuals. These are individuals with failings and contextualizations, just like we have.
Yeah.
But to be able to honor that past, give some graciousness to the past, as certainly I hope, the decisions I make in this era and that others make will be, afforded 161 years from now.
If,
And
if
but
we're-
yeah, fingers crossed. But also, looking at these issues from proper contextualization, and the importance of learning context, learning perspective, learning to hopefully gain insight from what these men and women did.
yes.
And for two reasons: one, to honor our past; two, three reasons, I can't count tonight. First reason, to honor our past, and because these are our ancestors.
Yes.
Second, to gain a more broader perspective and hopefully a better understanding of human nature, because that hasn't changed and has not changed for an incredibly long time. And I was thinking about, well, anyway, I'll say that in a minute. And then lastly, to apply it to our own lives and to our own policies and to our own what ultimately will become histories very soon, in the hopes of avoiding past mistakes, avoiding future violence, and being unifying voices as we move forward.
Exactly. That is my hope as well.
It was also, we didn't get to this. It was a tidbit of information from like 2 weeks ago. General Earl Van Dorn, who Confederate general, West Point graduate, lost the Battle of Pea Ridge.
Yes.
Very contentious, fiery personality, was quite confident going in that he was going to win the Confederacy, I think, with the Battle of Pea Ridge. That did not happen. And then like 4 months later, he's killed, not in battle, but by a very jealous husband.
Those things do happen.
Yes.
Speaking of human nature.
Oops. And, oh, so now coming back to Eureka Springs, something I did not realize until we began research for this is really the opulence of Eureka Springs beginning in the 1880s.
Mhm.
That in 1879, I apologize, I earlier said 1889, and I was running, my wheels were running on that, and I'm like, that can't be right. Founded July 4th, 1879. Because the Crescent was built in 1886. I'm like, wait a second, 1879. So we are, but that the opulence of Eureka Springs is a story of reconstruction in the South by the victors.
It really is. I mean, pretty literally when you look at the people involved.
And I would hazard a guess that well, several things. One, were this so this is my current working theory, and there may be some people who get mad at me for this. I don't care. It's just a working theory, but and we talked about this before. There's all of these stories of the healing waters, and the big question that everyone has been focused on for years is what was in the water to make it healing. And I think the real answer is what wasn't. The fact that the water was actually clean, and coming to take the cure for, say, like 4 weeks, coming from urban settings. St. Louis had multiple epidemics based on,
and so forth.
Yes, all based on polluted waters. Basically, you cannot. Well, and it was the same issues, and it's so hard for us to, in a modern world now in the United States, it is so hard for us to even wrap our heads around this concept of not having clean water.
Well, the modern example would be Flint, Michigan.
Yes.
And people talk about why isn't something being done there, and I had that conversation with someone the other day too. That came up. That it's hard to believe that isn't fixed, but and everyone's appalled by it. But imagine that on a very widespread scale.
Yes, and this was something that for the we're just teetering on the thin, fragile edge of America, of not America's, but just of history. That clean water has been able to be available widespread to
very, very much so.
To mass populations. And one, it's always interesting to look at, say, for example, longstanding European history, where you have these renowned city centers, places like London, that would be getting along fairly well up until the population reached a tipping point in which basically there was too much sewage in the water to keep people from getting sick.
Exactly.
And then
and those that could find a way to try to deal with that, their empires lasted longer. That's one reason that the Romans lasted as long as they did, is because they had good running water.
Yes. In aqueducts that still function, which is quite impressive.
Yes, still used in many places.
Yes. And so I would heavily postulate that the Ozark water is not magic. It was simply the Ozark water was clean.
Yeah.
And so if your disease in question, of course, disease was much less understood at that time. And so if your disease in question was associated with polluted water, if you had enough money to travel and do this, and come to Eureka Springs or Ponce or Otovie or any of these locations and quote unquote take the cure, you would get better, of course, if your health issues
were not more polluted water in. Yeah.
That would be the same across the board with any of the healing springs. But Eureka Springs got some of the wealthiest Union Reconstructionists west of the Mississippi to decide it would be a good place to speculate for land. And
well, but and I think that really does come not only just Reconstruction, but out of the Civil War, because the springs were used as a hospital.
Yes, they were. So there is that cultural tie. And it's now my question, I don't know the answer. Now, I think it's fair to say that the area, the springs and the bluffs, the caves, etc., were obviously utilized by the Osage and possibly the Caddo, simply because it makes sense.
Yeah, I'm sure they were. Yeah.
So I'm not debating that. I do question much of the 1870s into the early 20th century that has had these glowing brochures saying that basically it's the magic Indian legend.
Yes, yes. The Indian princess was healed of blindness, I believe, if I recall.
Yes. And it was a Sioux chief
Oh,
and a Sioux Indian princess. I'm going now. For the record, the Osage are of the Siouan people. The Osage speak a Siouan dialect, so there is that. The imagery in our heads, however, of the Lakota, of the Dakotas, somehow showing up in Eureka Springs, complete with princess who is magically healed, seems a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, that's not exactly how it went, I'm sure.
I'm guessing not. But we do have something very interesting in terms of white settler Indian legends. And this is a case of an Indian princess who simply gets her sight back from magic waters and is not leaping from a cliff.
Well, at least it's a little more unique. No suicidal princess this time.
No, yeah. Of all the legends in Eureka Springs, we have yet to find a suicidal Indian princess.
Give them time.
Either give us time to find it or give somebody else time to make it up. It is up for grabs. Now, the 6-story quartz limestone behemoth elephant in the room is the Crescent Hotel.
It was a matter of time until it was mentioned.
Well, I mention it for this purpose. This episode is about the noir and particularly the ghost stories that are associated with Eureka Springs that are not in the Crescent Hotel. We may dedicate an entire episode to that. Who knows? We may actually get permission and go shoot an episode from the Crescent, which I would love that. High key scale. Just asking. But from a cultural standpoint, and this I think deserves just some of our discussion as we transition into some of our ghost stories, and is that not very long ago, Eureka Springs really just exploded onto the paranormal map.
Yeah.
And specifically with the Crescent Hotel. Now,
it did.
Just a little bit of how that happened. I'm just curious as your thoughts are just sort of a very brief overview of how that took place.
I think how it happened, twofold. One, there was some pretty good business management with foresight that haunted tourism would work. So many places are afraid to do it. But there's a handful of places that really have capitalized on it. New Salem, Massachusetts, Savannah, Georgia has done a good job of that. And there's a few others, but and usually those were coordinated efforts, by multiple entities. But I think the Crescent really just started promoting itself. And aside from the fact that they had, a great story, that you can spin into, the mad scientist, crazy doctor who wasn't the doctor story, that helps, a good story helps. And then reality TV with paranormal shows came along about the same time. And as the Crescent was building their mythos and their internal tours, it was a matter of time until the two worlds crashed and met each other. And so then you started getting a lot of more prominent investigators going down there, different TV shows, etc. And suddenly everyone that's enthusiastic about ghost tourism has a great place to go, and it just happens to be beautiful.
Yes. And that said, is the Crescent Hotel haunted? I believe it is, based on my personal experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's certainly, I think, appropriate for the location to be a center of paranormal tourism. Now, something that we're going to be and the Crescent Hotel is exquisitely beautiful and has an incredible history. And if you get a chance to go. Also, the pizza on the Sky Bar at the 4th floor is incredible, and the view is really nice too. Not that I've ever eaten pizza there. Anyway, several times actually. Anyway, but also bring a crowd, because they don't sell pizza by the slice. They just sell you a pizza.
Yeah.
And,
so unless you're doing eating contests, you probably won't bring a few people with you.
But they'll bring you a box, I've done that too. But because of this collision of reality TV and history and tourism, the Crescent Hotel, and to a lesser degree but still existent, the Basin Park Hotel, which is also an incredible hotel in downtown, have really eclipsed everything else in terms of paranormal stories. We've started digging. We found some really interesting things that are not in those areas, and then also just an incredibly fascinating history throughout all of Eureka Springs.
Yeah, and I always like to find the stories that aren't as well known.
Yeah.
It's funny, and in the paranormal field, investigators will say, and to an extent, I think this could be true, that one side effect of a place being so popular, if it gets investigated all the time, is it can be hunted to death. It can be there are places like Waverly Hills and Valeska Axe Murder House, places like that people investigate 7 days a week, year round. And then people start complaining, oh, it was flat, nothing happened. Well, you're draining all the energy. If you were a spirit in there, you get tired of company too.
You done wore the ghosts out.
Pretty much. And so, that is one of those things. And so that is sort of a side effect, is that, sometimes, people will go to the Crescent and not have an experience. I have not had one there. I'm not, but I'm not saying it's not haunted by any means, but, but an advantage of some places that are not on the map is that often you get a lot of activity.
Yes. And sometimes those places can just be literally steps away from the place that's getting all of the attention.
Exactly, just around the corner. Mm-hmm.
And there are a number of those. Let's start with this one. There's the New Orleans Hotel.
Okay.
It's downtown. It's up the street from the Flatiron Building, and from the sort of the crossroads. Originally opened in 1892 as the Wadsworth, and was so many of these hotels were really the height of prestige and luxury during their eras. In 1915, the now New Orleans Hotel came with steam heat, electric lights, and in many cases, a bathroom a
Mhm.
private bath, depending on what you want to pay. Now, I was just looking at hotel prices that like start at $123 a night. They started at $1.
Mhm.
Actually, if you want a communal bathroom, it was going to be 50 cents a night, and if you wanted one with your own bath, it was going to be $1. But there's some interesting, comparatively brief but interesting hauntings associated with this.
Yes. I do find it interesting. Of course, there's a maintenance man or janitor that supposedly died in the building,
Mhm.
in the elevator, I believe, and that uh, people will have experiences that lead them to believe it's him, and that he's come, that he's looking over the building, basically.
Yes, and many of these associations do not seem to be at all malevolent or negative. They actually seem to be very kindly, peaceful, or watching over the space. Perhaps a little sad, perhaps a little melancholy, but not stories of violent hauntings.
No, well, and most hauntings fall into those categories. Uh, they're not the melodramatic, over the top things that you see in movies. But I really liked the one of someone finding their room gone through.
That was very interesting. Now, there were elements of this, and this is a very recent recollection. It was actually
Hmm.
just earlier this year.
Hmm.
Um, there are what I'm very confused by this story. So there's elements, and of course you really can't. And it was an anonymous.
Right.
It was an anonymous entry or sharing. So it's very difficult to, as with any type of paranormal report, it's very difficult to get a clear picture of the report without being able to have a good feeling for the people who were sharing it.
Exactly.
um, but in short, based on the printed report, um, uh, two women. I feel like the implication is they're comparatively young women
That was my assumption.
who check in at the New Orleans hotel and had requested an early check-in. We're told that an early check-in would be ready. Then they're given room 106, which apparently happens to be a room that there's a lot of activity associated with.
Mhm.
And they go to find their room on the second floor, and they can't find it.
Right.
And then they come back down to the front desk and say, we can't find our room. And then they go back, and there's their room. However, the doors open and the room is a complete mess.
Hmm.
And then apparently the desk clerk apologizes and says, we'll have your room cleaned up. We thought it was ready. I'm sorry, we told you it was ready. It's not ready.
Hmm.
Now, up till this point, there's nothing there that would necessarily be attributed to something paranormal.
Right. There could be several explanations for this.
Yes, yes, yes. And we'll leave those explanations to your collective imagination. Um,
Exactly.
but while they are staying in the room, they experience several different phenomena.
Hmm.
One is a sensation of someone sitting on their bed. The sensation of someone has come in and sat down. They feel them sit down on their bed, freaks them out. And when the girl wakes up, is scared, turns on the lights, and then at a later point, the girl with her says, well, I didn't want to freak you out, but earlier I heard someone come in the front door, open our door, go to the bathroom and turn the water on. But there was
Yeah.
no one, but there was no one physical in the room at any given time. And so that portion of it, now we're actually dealing with a report, an alleged report of activity.
Right. Exactly. And each of those elements are fairly common occurrences, taken individually.
Yeah.
Sitting on the bed is fairly common, particularly in a hotel or an inn. People have those experiences. Of course, the sound of a door or footsteps is fairly common. Water running is not that uncommon. I would be interested to know if, I would love to know if they got up and went to see if the water really was running.
It would
Because
be
sometimes that
interesting.
does happen. Hauntings
And,
is that, suddenly the bathtub or the sink will turn on.
and this is an interesting sort of cross-reference. Again, we've talked about the healing waters. We've talked about the fact that they probably weren't magic, quote unquote. Right. It was probably the lack of an ingredient rather than the addition of an ingredient that could have been could have been promoting health. However, on a supernatural level, water, and particularly running water, is heavily associated with movement of spirit.
It is, and just energy in general. And I've investigated a handful of places over the years where that happened. One place in particular would be at the Prosperity School Bed and Breakfast, which unfortunately is no longer a bed and breakfast. It's a private home, which I've been wondering how they're going, how well they're doing. But anyway, but that is something that would happen there quite often, would be not only the sound of running water, but one of the bathtubs, the faucet would be turned on in the middle of the night.
Wow. Would it overflow? Would it just keep going till it overflowed, or would it just run out?
Now, I don't, as far as I know, it never overflowed. But the owners had been gotten up in the middle of the night a number of times with a guest who had been awoken with the sound of the water and go turn it off. But I never heard that they actually had overflowing, but and I don't think that it was generally would run, like full open, so that it would, it would be running for quite a while before that. But there were two different rooms that tended to happen in there.
Very, very interesting. Now, just me doing general analysis on this particular account in room 106 at the New Orleans Hotel. The report of the two assumptively young women who stayed was that they felt that the presence did not want them there. And they based that on simply the fact that someone sat down on their bed, apparently either did or seemed to have turned the water on, and then the room being quote unquote trashed beforehand. And I would generally disagree. So again, coming back to sort of our category of the normalization of the paranormal, I would respectfully disagree with that conclusion, in saying that not being able to find the room and having the room quote unquote trash have nothing to do potentially with the paranormal.
Likely not.
And having an occupant of the hotel, a disembodied occupant of the hotel, enjoying the same space that they're in, does not mean that the occupant does not want them there.
No, and in fact, might not even be aware of their presence.
Sorry, guys, you're just not that important.
We're doing this. We're not running into each other. But now on the other hand, there are hauntings where things will be rearranged, or at times, items, say in a bedroom, would be, on the floor or whatever, kind of messed up, but not always in a negative way or an antagonistic way. I mean, the Kendrick house is a good example. In the children's room, it's not too uncommon for the children's dressing gowns to be on the floor. But there's no indication that it's, meant in a way to, scare anyone, or that they're upset with anyone. So, so even if it were paranormal, I'm not sure that it would mean that they didn't want them there.
No. And this brings up another subject that I'm interested in, just sort of hypothesizing a little bit. The idea of going to look for room 106 and not being able to find it. There's a number of things, that very, very normal things that you can chalk up from, comparative jet lag. I've been driving for too long, just wasn't sure where I was, those types of things.
Or just get turned around a little bit. Yeah.
Completely. I want to go in the hotel now. I've been by it many, many times. Walked by it many, many times. It's gorgeous. Every one of these locations is gorgeous. And if you are so inclined, we highly encourage you to look up the location, book a room, check these places out. You're not going to go wrong in Eureka Springs doing that. But an interesting thing, again, coming back to like these theories of the running water, theories of the sort of the magical powers of quartz crystal in mass, sort of energy output. The idea that Eureka Springs is some sort of a permanent, naturally occurring vortex of some sort, or portal. The idea that this particular area might have been disorienting for reasons of this nature.
Yeah. And that is true. I mean, that does happen in places with activity. Well, actually, a plug too, we'll be at the George Ball House on June 11th, and there is actually a room in that house that is disorienting when you walk in. And why? I haven't exactly figured that one out yet, but it's the same room, and a lot of people will have the same experience. So,
wow, yeah. And those moments, those places happen. I will be one to say that all of downtown Eureka has a tendency to do that to me.
I get a little disoriented there at times, which is not real common for me.
And same. I'm normally very, very specific on my north, south, east, and west. And what is consistently weird for me is within the downtown historic district. I am very specific on my north, south, east, and west. It's just that by the compass stand, how the compass stands, those directions have rotated 180 degrees. If I'm heading up the hill to go to the Thai restaurant or Harp's grocery store, in here, I swear I'm going north. And I'm not. I'm going south. It is very weird. So that's just me. Coming back to this things getting moved around, referencing a great book by our Dark Ozarks friend Bud Steed, Haunted Northwest Arkansas. Highly recommended.
I do too.
He talks about a number of things, but in this case, the Palace Bathhouse, or Palace Bath Hotel and Bathhouse. Its official name, I believe, is Palace Hotel and Bath House. That said, I just call it Palace Bathhouse, and I always have, and I always probably will. But it was built in 1901. Native limestone, as much of the substantial buildings in Eureka Springs are. And it was a bordello. and now it's a hotel and spa.
And
And
it wasn't a bordello that was hiding either. So
no, not by any stretch of the imagination. If you
no.
walk around the corner, you can see it by its giant lighted neon sign that looks like something you'll recognize.
Yeah.
Blinking on and off that says "Welcome to the Bordello." But something was very interesting was pointed out to me in an interview that I did a couple of years ago with the general manager. Is that, of course, the neon sign, which is done in a late 1930s arabesque style. It's not the oldest. So, important clarification. There's a rumor that is floating around that it is the oldest neon sign west of the Mississippi River, and it isn't, and that's provable. However, it is certainly one of the early neon signs, during the era, and it looks incredibly suggestive. So we'll keep it G-rated and leave it at that. But look it up if you're curious. That said, this was probably certainly in the 1930s, possibly a little bit early in the 1920s. I'm not sure. I'm trying to remember. It's been a while since I did that interview. But the palace opened in 1901, and so there could be an erroneous conclusion that the phallic nature of the business was, showed up with the neon sign. No, it did not. It was pretty much a part of the building since 1901 when it opened. And it was pointed out to me in the interview that the columns, it's a beautiful structure, the carved columns that are on the corners of the building look markedly similar to the neon sign.
Yes.
So this is pretty much baked into the entire thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's the architecture was advertising.
Yes, and there's conflicting reports in terms. I shouldn't say conflicting, because paranormal investigation incidences are usually very contradictory in and of themselves, or the layers don't necessarily just line up. Right. But there's there seems to be a wide variance of activity. Yeah,
there does seem to be a lot of different things going on.
And I would love to do an investigation there, just throwing that out into the world, and I may ask to do that soon. But the story that Bud recorded in his book, which again we recommend that you get, Haunted Northwest Arkansas by Bud Steed, it involves a pretty dramatic interaction between a couple who check into one of the rooms and essentially a ghost.
Yes.
And one that is a full-bodied apparition.
Yeah. Let's see. And a lot of people believe that she was a working girl.
Yes, which, considering the brothel nature, the bordello nature of the building, it really makes sense.
Yeah.
Essentially, a girl that's seen in the mirror. Which, for the record, I still think is more unsettling than just seeing something straight out.
The Coleman.
Yes. But that there isn't anything in this particular report. There's nothing that is malevolent associated with this apparition. No. The couple get the strong inclination that she's a very sweet girl, but she seems very sad and lonely. And the activity in the room suggests that.
Yeah. it really does. Or a longing of some sort. Clothes being, the lady's clothes being moved, played with, perfume bottle, and then them actually saying, if you want it, take it, and at the end it disappeared.
Yes.
To me, it's almost like a remembrance of her life, like, oh, these things reminded her of things that, and maybe she was melancholy.
Yes. And there's pure speculation
Mhm.
that as a working girl, which of course is a euphemism for prostitute, that she was perhaps killed in the room and could not, as a result, leave. That seems a little sketchy.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't, and if I recall, if I recall, I think Bud said he couldn't substantiate, you
No,
know,
no.
that, um, and this may be upset some people, as you said earlier, might upset some people, but so many people will get hung up on, a spirit supposedly being stuck, and really, my experience is I don't think that happens very often at all.
Mm.
Um, Uh, in fact, there's a lot of situations where it's pretty apparent that they cross the veil and come back and go back and forth.
Yes.
I think for the most part, when someone's present, they're wanting to be present, and it's usually some sort of connection, and whether it's happy, sad, or just a beautiful place they liked, or it was home, or who knows why, but um maybe just a sense of being familiar.
Yes. I think that there are times that we can associate or attach more grandiose or gothic or tragic associations with hauntings,
Mm-hmm.
and overlook the mundane.
That's true. And I think one reason for that is, one, people want to feel like there's a differentiation between the us and them, the
Yeah.
other,
Hmm.
um, and they want to solve a puzzle, and they want to feel like they know the answers to, we can make this better if, and I don't think we know enough to be able to make those assumptions.
No, I don't think that we do. And again, I think that's very, it's funny to be associating it in this way, but we do want to other um the dead.
We do. It's a way of forestalling, the realization that uh, we will become the dead.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes. and
it's the
and
it's
and
the
in the great,
Victorian tombstone saying that, the exact wording is escaping me right now, but um, you know, where you are, I was, etc. Where I
yes.
am will be, which ironically, in a lot of places, when a tombstone has that saying on it, lore grows up that it's a witch's grave. And it's like,
Which
I've never quite understood that, but
which is further othering, actually, in that
mhm,
in
yeah,
that regard. And I think it's the again, that internal or psychological pushback, that somehow we exist in life immortally, and
yeah.
that that everyone that's dead is somehow some sort of fantastic monster or something, and that's
And
it's
and if we can put them away, put them in their box, then we don't have to think about it or contemplate our own mortality. I think that has a
yeah.
lot to do with it too.
Yes. Do you think that there's a strong push in the interest of the paranormal to do that, and thus actually essentially box that away, even within the interest of it?
I think there are segments of the field that end up doing that. But again, there's, some of those segments probably would not be too happy with me, and you probably know who some of them are, because they tend to make money off of that portrayal.
Yeah.
Either I can communicate with them and tell you exactly what it is for a fee, or buy expensive things for me and you can do it. Or
Right.
I will put them in the box for you so you don't have to think about it.
Right. Or in this case, like the idea that a tragic event occurred, and somehow that has tied the spirit there.
Yeah.
There's a murder, there's a death, there's something unthinkable or unspeakable associated. It's doing something terrible for this, and then only this, so then you avoid that location. Or if you're feeling highly adventurous, then you go to that location.
Yeah.
But you certainly don't want the idea that a presence, a sentient, someone who has died and likes your house could be, sitting at the breakfast table, wondering why you're eating eggs instead of oatmeal.
Exactly. People don't want to think about that.
It's, and there are elements, there are incidences that really are, from our perception, other. There are rare cases of interaction with malevolence that is other. There are things that are outside of this, but the majority of hauntings, the majority of these occurrences are weird in how normal they are, not weird in how abnormal they are.
Exactly. But of course that can kind of freak you out too, because it is so, our culture has othered death so much that and continues to make a separation, because now we don't mourn in the home, we don't have a wake in the home or a funeral, we don't care for the dead in the home, everything's sanitized, and people don't die in the home very often anymore. It's in a clinical hospital, it's very sanitized, sterile environment in a hospital and then a funeral home, and so we detach ourselves. And so this thing that we're detached from is supposed to be so alien that the concept that they're sitting there reading the newspaper, eating cereal with us, is probably more frightening than the monstrosity from the grave.
It really is. And the one of the other Eureka Springs hauntings that Bud Steed collected, that really fits into that, is the haunting at St. Elizabeth's Catholic Church.
Yes, I really liked that one.
I did too. And it's a haunting. I've been, near the church many times. I've been in front of the church. I've walked by it. I've photographed it. It's gorgeous. It's just down the hill from the Crescent Hotel. And it was, the basic gist is that that there's a well-spoken, polite man, not very tall, slender build, mid to late 40s, salt and pepper, gray hair that's cut short and part on the side, generally described as handsome, who surprises people a little bit, may stand and talk for a few minutes, and then vanishes.
Right. And they believe that he's a living person.
Yes.
That it's not opaque, it's not transparent, it's, they're having a conversation and then boom, he's not there.
And he's not there. And usually that is startled a little bit by his initial appearance, but just assumed that they weren't paying attention and he just walked up.
Right. Which does happen, especially if you're, looking at, new place and paying attention to, something. That's not that unusual. But I am always fascinated with those kind of stories. I mean, I've had a couple of experiences like that where, one in particular was at Fort Scott, at the fort, that walked into a building and had a conversation with who I assumed was one of the rangers in period clothing, talking about stories from the building, and as real as can be. And then when I went back up to the gift shop and said, complimented them on what a great job he did, they looked at me, said that we don't have anyone out there today.
Oh, and I think those are very, very magical moments, actually.
Oh, I do too. I mean, it was, I would never have guessed that, I wasn't talking to someone.
Now, interesting question. I want to get your thoughts on this. It seems that in many cases with the full-bodied interactive apparition that is indistinguishable from the living.
Yeah.
That if the person who's talking to them doesn't know that they're a ghost,
right,
that it seems to go on, as opposed to like if they realize at some point that something's not right,
then they tend to disappear.
Does that seem to be the case?
In some cases, yeah. I think a lot of the stories where people that I've heard where they really thought it was a living person, that they are more extended encounters, at least a minute or two. I mean, I stood there and talked to this fella for 3 or 4 minutes, at least. And but yeah, there's sometimes you get that sense that, suddenly, wait a minute, something's not quite right, and then it tends to fade. But then I also I've had an experience where, I'm sure I've probably told you this, where 2 of us actually saw a fellow walking down the road.
Yes.
And he looked like he was out of the Depression era. And I mean, well, the other person just in fact described it as like he'd walked out of a prop set, on a movie, because it was just so perfectly right out of that time period, but the color was just slightly off. And so, for an instant you think, oh, it's a real person and he's walking into the road, and then you realize there's something wrong. But he stayed in view until we were out of sight. So I think it can go either way.
That's fair. I think it's fascinating. Now, as we mentioned the 6 degrees of separation. There's a ton of them associated with Eureka Springs, but General Paul Clayton, his brother was significant in Fort Smith, and the Clayton House is
Clayton House, which is haunted.
Yes. And the current, it's in the other Clayton house, being General Clayton's Eureka Springs residence that was built. And for the record, so General Clayton, after no longer being governor of Arkansas, did not retire. His career simply continued.
Shifted.
And yes, and I found this so interesting. There's points in his young life, because he was born in Pennsylvania, but then he ends up in Leavenworth, Kansas, as a surveyor. And interestingly enough, as a surveyor, he also starts making money as a land speculator. You can't imagine there's any time. And
first one there, basically.
Yes, exactly. And then his first elected office was, he got himself elected, successfully ran for city engineer of the city of Leavenworth in 1860. And so we have this young man, very industrious, has been through a military academy, and in Pennsylvania, obviously pro-union, and then trained as a surveyor, familiar with land speculation, then gets his feet under him in city engineering for developing the city of Leavenworth. Then the war occurs, ends up leasing a plantation in Pine Bluff, then buying a plantation from the Department of Treasury. You figure out how they got that, and and ultimately amassing property of 40,000 acres in Arkansas.
Yeah.
So but then founds essentially this Eureka Springs Improvement Company. I don't remember if that's exactly the title, but that's basically the title.
Yeah.
And sets about, and I don't know this at all, but I can't help but wonder if this 1880s project for Powell Clayton wasn't almost being like a kid in a candy store saying, I have all this know-how. I know land, I know city infrastructure, I know all of these things, and now I can apply it with basically no limit.
With no limit and kind of carte blanche, because there wasn't a lot there. So instead of going into an area that already was built up and you have to deal with the roads are already built in a weird way or this or that, he had a blank canvas.
Yes, and boy howdy did he. You really could say that that the general built Eureka Springs as we know it today.
Pretty much, it seems, yeah. And then he and Kearns brought the railroad in, and so between that,
and of course, and Kearns was a friend and colleague of Powell. Brought him in. That's how St. Elizabeth's Church came to be.
Right.
Kearns built St. Elizabeth's Church in honor of his mother. And it's, obviously these were very heady days with, these incredible connections with the wealthy industry of the nation, with these connections, obviously, with the railroad, unbelievably wealthy railroad magnates, etc. And just the sense of, well, do I want the most beautiful church that I could possibly imagine on the hillside? Sure, why not? Let's just do that. And then let's import the marble statues from Italy, because we can. Right.
And you see that in certain places where you had the kind of money flowing, some of the mining districts, etc. And then here, not always the same combination of factors that made the money happen, but if it comes together, some very beautiful things can happen.
Yes, and in regards to Eureka Springs, in so many levels, they did, and we are just fortunate beyond belief that the majority of those structures and locations are all still there, being preserved, and in various ways you can interact with them. It's really quite amazing.
And then I think that's the really unique thing, is that so many of these places have survived, where so many places they didn't. And you can't always say, oh, they were built better or because they were stone. A lot of stone and brick buildings didn't survive. And it didn't succumb to the urban renewal plague of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s.
Thank goodness. And a lot of that actually was the remoteness of the region. There wasn't a lot of industry.
That's true.
Taking place in the region. It was particularly interesting. The decline of popularity of taking the cure, of going to the healing springs, has largely been associated with the advent of antibiotics.
Yeah.
That said, I do find it interesting because the rise of widespread clean water is also going to follow that trajectory.
That's true. They come hand in hand.
Mhm.
It was about the same period that you started having, widespread public sanitation and water treatment plants and so forth.
So that would just be an interesting thing to look at. But the Depression, possibly the widespread access to clean water, certainly the Great Depression, the transition of mass transit from railroad to automobile,
Mm-hmm.
and the Second World War, all heavily impacted or negatively impacted Eureka Springs.
They did. It really did. But they reinvented themselves for tourism again in a way that not many places do.
That they have, and that of course began in the late 1960s, and
Right.
and has continued to this day. And much of the interesting elements of history associated, like the story, the history of Eureka Springs is still in the telling.
Yeah, it really is. And I think there's a lot more ghost stories there too.
I do too. Now we've got, actually, I'm gonna a little bit more research. We probably have room for like at least another episode on this subject.
Probably, yes.
That said,
Besides Crescent.
yes, and the Crescent and the Basin. There's just incredible things. We still have some more material to cover. I'm about to get hit by a giant thunderstorm, so
Okay, we might want to wind it up then.
just kind of start winding it up. Something real quickly, that said, and possibly as our final. In terms of underground Eureka, of course, there's a whole story with that. We can get into that perhaps a bit later. But there is an interesting legend, and it is legend, but that there are underground tunnels leading from the Crescent Hotel to other locations.
Oh, can't imagine. And I've never heard these kind of things before.
And there's three. They all fit into the category of legend, but I'll just share the three for contemplation because I think they're unbelievably entertaining.
Okay.
One that mad scientist, crazy Dr. Norman Baker, we'll get into him later, had an escape tunnel from the Crescent out into the woods. Of course, if he did, it didn't work very well because the feds got him in 1940. So there's that. There is a legend that says that there was an underground passageway that led from the Crescent all the way down to the current location of the Carnegie Library.
That would be a long ways through rock.
And that it was used for ladies of the evening to come. Actually the German Alley neighborhood was essentially a working class neighborhood, and that the ladies of the evening would transit through the tunnel so they would not be seen by respectable society and emerge for their clients at the Crescent. The layout, the logistics of all of this are unsupported.
Yeah.
And
of course, I'm also thinking here in Joplin there were tunnels and they did connect these places, but it was the high-end clientele that used the tunnels to go to the ladies.
yes, so in reverse. And
in reverse, yeah.
And then the last one is that there was a tunnel that connected the Crescent Hotel, went all the way down to the train station, and was used to transit moonshine during the Depression. And during, or more specifically during Prohibition, which
I think there would have been easier ways to do it.
Much easier ways to do it. Also, during the beginning of Prohibition, the Crescent Hotel was not a gambling den; it was the girls' school.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Romantic story, but I don't think I have my doubts.
I do too. That said, there are underground passages in portions of Eureka, And of course,
Mhm.
plenty of caves, plenty of springs. There's a lot of incredible stuff to give rise to these legends, but I just think they're very engaging and very entertaining.
I do too. I do too. And that might be a good point to end on tonight.
I'm good with that. We've got lots of great stuff coming.
Yeah.
Excited. Hope to see everyone at Carthage on
Yeah.
Saturday or Sunday. It's going to be a great
Yeah,
time.
it
And
is.
of course, Ball House is coming up.
Mhm.
Um, October Country
Yep.
is coming
It's
up.
on the page, and shout out to Always Buying Books. Thank you for supporting us.
Absolutely. And we will we will convene very soon.
Yes, we will. And we'll be back here next Wednesday.
Absolutely. We thank you all.
Thank you. Good night, all.
Night, everybody.